Welcome to Against the Mountains of Madness. I'm your host, Jason Rennie,
And I'm your host, John C. Wright.
and today we're going to be discussing happiness in the Twilight Zone. We're going to be using the episode A Nice Place to Visit from the first season of The Twilight Zone, and we'll be getting into some Thomas Aquinas later on. So it should be fun. So, John, A Nice Place to Visit, a season 1 episode of The Twilight Zone where Rocky Valentine, a small-time hoodlum, meets a grisly end in an alley running from the police, and then meets a fellow that bears a not inconsiderable resemblance to you named Pip.
Yes, of course, he and I are probably working for the same trip. For those few viewers who don't know, Twilight Zone was an anthology TV series done by the genius of Rod Serling, and it indulged in either science fiction, fantasy, or weird tales type episodes, often with a twist ending or some other cutting insight into human nature. And I would say Rod Serling does not disappoint in this particular episode. The guy playing Mr. Pip is, of course, Sebastian Cabot, who then escorts Rocky Valentine, described as being a man who had a hard life, to a beautiful apartment where he's given to understand that he will be getting anything that he desires. And Rocky
Yep.
is both ridiculously ungrateful and refers to Mr. Pip as a fatso during the whole process, even though he gets a fresh meal, new clothes, money to spend, and so on and so forth. And things just seem to be getting better and better.
Everything's
Do
going
you want
his
me
way.
to spoil the surprise ending of a 50, 60-year-old episode?
Well,
Because I think we have to discuss it.
We'll get to it. We'll get to that. But yes,
Okay.
and Rocky is then indulging his love of women and gambling all the time with a niggling in the back of his mind, like, this is heaven. What the heck am I doing here? Pretty sure I shouldn't be here. If it's all right with them, it's all right with me.
Well, he finally finds out that he's dead when
Yes.
he takes a gun and tries to shoot Mr. Pip, and the bullets don't harm the guy, but he can shoot a lamp, and he knows the bullets are real.
Yep.
And he begins to notice that things are appearing and disappearing as he desires them. So he knows something really odd is going on. But this is the Twilight Zone, see? So you don't know, the viewer doesn't know at that point if it's something supernatural, if he's been kidnapped by aliens, if it's an experiment by time travelers. It could be anything.
Anything,
That was
yes.
the beauty of the Twilight Zone show. You simply didn't know. You see?
I agree. And then, of course, we get to the end where, oh no, he asks to see his permanent record, and Pip obliges and takes him to check his file.
I have to
Go
interrupt
on.
and say one thing.
Sure.
The permanent record set was so eerie looking. It was nothing but a stone staircase with the gigantic words "record" to
Yep.
one side, and Hall of Records, and filing cabinets underneath a stormy, cloudy sky. Okay, so with very simple visual effects, the Twilight Zone managed to create a sensation of eeriness, both here and a little later when Rocky decides to play a game of pool. He goes, aha, like he's going to have fun. He takes the cue,
Yep.
he taps the cue ball, and then they do a stop motion, beautiful. It's seamless.
It's well done,
Stop
yeah, it's
motion
well done.
camera. Every single ball falls into the holes in one shot.
Off the break, yeah.
And in rage, Rocky breaks the pool cue over his knee. You see.
Yes.
So, and everything was very subtle and very perfect. By that I mean, Mr. Pip, for example, when he first comes on stage, all you see is his shoes, which are pure white, and his pants are pure white, and his jacket is pure white, and so is his hair and beard. The actor took 3 months to get the bleach out of his scalp from
Really?
that to shoot. See. Now, those of you who don't remember, Sebastian Cabot was the English butler on A Family Affair, and he's also the voice of Bagheera from The Jungle Book. So he's the
Okay.
last person you'd expect to be sinister, but he simply smiles at Valentine. The more Valentine insults him, or shoots him, or behaves in this peevish, really ungrateful, really horrible fashion.
Yep.
And then, like you said, and then Valentine realizes he's dead and goes, "Oh well, I must be in heaven."
Yes.
And Mr. Pip just smiles. He doesn't say yes. He doesn't say
Nope.
no.
No, he doesn't.
And it just gets creepier and creepier because Sebastian Cabot, I've only ever seen him in other shows being a good guy, okay?
Okay.
But in this, he is so smooth and so genial and so what's the word? when you beckon or lure someone in, so welcoming. You know, that's not quite the word. I can't quite think of it. But he's like the way sin is, which is a broad, easy, smooth path into the other place.
Yes.
So,
And then, yes, finally Rocky is getting frustrated with the whole thing. He's tired of always winning. He's tired of never losing. He wants to rob a bank, which would be exciting. And Mr. Pip will oblige him. Yes, of course. If you'd like to rob a bank, we can organize that. Is there any chance of being caught? Would you like there a chance to be caught? We can arrange that. And he's just getting frustrated because nothing is meaning anything to him anymore.
Perhaps you missed your old vocation, is that it?
Now you're getting it.
Well, there's a nice bank at the corner that you could rob, or would you prefer a jewelry store?
No, bank's okay.
Well, fine. Now, as to the getaway car, well, we have quite a large variety to choose from. Something inconspicuous, I imagine.
Wait a minute. Is there a chance that I could get caught?
Of course, if that's what you'd like. Let me just make a note of it.
Now, come on, sit down, Pat, sit down. Now, look. I don't know how to explain this, but it just ain't the same thing. I mean, what's the kick knocking off a bank if everybody knows about it? Huh?
he also says that he gets tired of women, which is hard to imagine. But even Rocky says, all these dames, it's just, I couldn't believe it. I would get tired of dames. Now, here's what's funny is, Mr. Pip earlier says that they're not real. And Rocky says, you mean they're like props? He says, yeah. And, of course, Rocky doesn't want anything out of a woman aside from her props, so to speak. The censors did not want Rod Serling to have him ask for a woman who was stacked, okay? But he kind of got away with it, because the censorship in those days was so polite. You know, the guy was in hell, and he was clearly I spoiled the surprise ending. The guy's in the other place, and he's clearly a lowlife, but he was not allowed to say. He's not allowed to say what he was really desiring. And so, even when the beautiful women, he's got a blonde, he's got a redhead, he's got a brunette. I assume it's a redhead. I can't tell in black and white.
Yeah.
And she goes, "Is there anything else you want, Mr. Valiant?" You know. And the censor said she's got to deliver that line in a sweet fashion, not as if she's offering him anything. But of course, it was
obvious. Yeah, I mean, it was.
But even dames, Valiant is sick of. He throws them out of the office.
Is there anything else I can do for you?
Yeah, get out of here, will you? I'm sick of looking at you. Come on, out. You too. Come on, out. Let's go. Come on. Come on, get out of here. Come on, get out.
No, all of these things ring hollow. And I like right at the end, he goes, I don't belong here. Maybe I should go to the other place. Oh, no, he wanted to see his friends. And that's when he discovered they're all props.
Hey, Fat, how about tomorrow we look up some of my old buddies, huh? Like Matt Gorman, Fink Mitchell, Silky Armstrong, huh? What's the matter? They didn't make it?
No, it's not that, Mr. Valentine. It's rather difficult to explain, really. You see, all of this, it's your own private domain. It was made, especially for you alone.
Oh, well, what about them? You mean they're props, like in a movie?
In a sense, yes. Everything here is, except, of course, you and me.
In fact, he names his friends by names, and he can't go there. Oh, I want to harken back before we go on to his friends. He's going to be alone except for props. That's the heaven he thinks he's in. But when they were in the scene where he was going through his records, and he did things like killed a dog when he was a kid, and organized a street gang called the Angels. There was one thing I noticed that was very interesting about a show made in the 50s, which would not have happened if the show had been made later. There's no exculpatory material in the file. There's nothing in the file that says he was an orphan, or that he was beaten by his father, or that his mother was a drunk. Nothing like that. It just lists the things he did as a kid when he's trying to figure out why he's in this paradise. And he looks at the file and he can't puzzle it out. He can't figure out, what did I... He says, I must have done something really good, to make up for all the rotten things I did. But I can't quite bring it to mind. I wonder what it was,
Yep.
And so the creep factor just goes up and up and up. But it's speaking as a writer, it's a really well constructed 3-act play. The first act is he gets killed, shooting at the cops. You'll never get me, you lousy screws. Okay. In the second, he's getting everything he wants. He gets women, he gets wine, women, and song. He goes gambling. He wins every game. In the third, he gets increasingly frustrated. He finds out that not there. He finds out that he's dead, and he finds out that he's not in heaven for any good reason. He doesn't understand why he's there. And then in the third act, he just gets increasingly frustrated with all the comforts he's given because he lives a life of nothing but pleasure, and he can't stand it. He's going insane.
It's understandable. And then finally, at the end, he wants to go to the other place.
Look, I don't belong in heaven, see? I want to go to the other place.
Heaven? Whatever gave you the idea you were in heaven, Mr. Valentine? This is the other place.
And I think that's one of the best laughs ever. And if you ever wanted to hear a truly evil laugh from a guy you thought was your friend, that's the guy. That's Sebastian Cabot's laugh in The Twilight Zone. Is Mr. Pip. It's just terrible.
Yes.
Oh, let me say something about the name Pip, by the way.
Sure.
I wondered why it was Pip. I wondered if it was like 616 upside down or something. So I looked up the word Pip in the dictionary, and it means a dot on a dice. So it's a gambling term. It's a dice term, which makes sense because Rocky's a gambler.
Mm-hmm.
But it also means to get the better of or to defeat someone. And Rocky is certainly defeated both at the beginning and at the end. It also means a spot or a speck, which kind of represents Rocky because he's just kind of a spot of a man. But it also means to get hit with a gunshot. If someone pips you, that means he shot you, which also describes Rocky. And then it's a slang term from that day and age, which means to be really excellent, to be a winner, to be of high quality, So I wonder how many of these ideas Sterling had in mind when he selected that name for his Mephistopheles character.
It'd be interesting to know. Unfortunately, we'd need a Ouija board. I'm not advocating that.
Having seen the records room now, I don't want to add to my list that's down there. You see.
That's fair. So I guess where this leads to is Rocky was offered a paradise of effectively unlimited self-indulgence. I mean, there was nothing he couldn't do if he wanted to. He only had to ask. He
could even lose if he wanted to, but he had to say how many times. I mean, under what conditions.
Yes.
And here's what's interesting. What's interesting is Rocky himself has enough insight to understand that there's something wrong with that. He can't put it into words because, of course, he's just a bum. He's just a crook. He's just a bum. But he says, it doesn't mean it. There's no kick. It doesn't mean anything.
Yes, there's no risk. There's no reward. Well,
right.
Without the risk, there's no reward. And he gets bored of it. It's interesting. We'll get more into the theological questions that obviously exist here, but this is the Islamic paradise. No, really, like it's rivers of honey and women, and it's literally, well, I'm sure if someone is out there and they want to correct me, that's fine, but at least from what I've seen of the Quran, this is what's promised to this paradise is what's promised to Muslims. I mean,
it's a paradise
in the appropriate sort of 7th century Arabian context, but it's an updated version of the same thing. Why not?
I have heard that there are Muslims who try to interpret those passages of the Quran more spiritually, and that the pleasures are spiritual. But
I would expect
the main tradition goes against that interpretation, at least as far as I, who am not Muslim, understand it. Yes, those women, those creatures that looked like women were huri. They were not women. They were props. And he's got wine, women, and song. He's got all the wealth he needs. You see.
Which.
But nothing to spend it on.
No. Well, this is. One of the things I thought was fascinating about this episode is St. Thomas Aquinas in his light beginner's introduction to theology. That's 6,000 pages long, and he didn't finish it before he died. The Summa Theologicae. But it's a summary for beginners. Don't forget.
That's why it's called a summary of theology.
Oh, I know. But it's the intro text.
Right. Unless summa means the sum of, unless it means the added, I don't,
Well,
I don't speak Latin.
It was intended as an introductory text, so it was intended as like a summary of everything, but also it was the beginner's volume, which is scary. It's enormous. Anyway, he has a So a lot of people would know would know Thomas's 5 ways and his argument for the existence of God. But I've always found particularly fascinating in his first part of the second part of the Summa Theologicae, he deals with the question of happiness. What is happiness? What does man's happiness consist in? And he has it's effectively what we'd call a reductio ad absurdum argument. His question 2 is things in which man's happiness consists. And then he goes through 8 different things, which we'll come back to. And the conclusion is none of these 8 things will work. And of these 8 things, the last one is any created good. So that's everything. Well, everything created. So whatever man's happiness consists in, it's got to be something that's uncreated. I'm pretty sure it's not numbers, so that leaves God by a process of elimination. And
right. In other words, he's arguing that if there's no God, then man will never be happy.
Well, that's what I've always found interesting about the argument. If you're having a discussion with someone and you reach an impasse over whether God exists or not, you can go, okay, let's step back a bit. What's man's final happiness? What's man's final end? What will truly satisfy him? If God doesn't exist, and the only logical answer to that question is God, that's a problem.
The atheist will simply say, the atheist is left with 2 choices then. One of sorrow and one of anger. Either he says that happiness consists of hedonism, of seeking pleasure, and that what we call moral good is merely pleasure seeking at a higher level, or refined level.
Thomas touches on that.
or stoicism, doing your duty without expectation of reward, whether you're happy or not. You simply do what your conscience tells you ought to do. As best I can tell, those are the only 2 other logical possibilities aside from happiness consisting of communion with the Lord, or with any monotheistic deity. You need some sort of transcendental source of joy for joy to be joy. Okay. Otherwise, that's what I think is the only other option. And the honest atheist will either say I don't know to answer the question, or say men die, everything is futile, there is no happiness on earth. Which Christians will agree. We agree there's no happiness on earth.
We've read Ecclesiastes.
The interesting thing about the Twilight Zone episode is I think there's no happiness in earthly paradise either. That's what the show meant. That's what the show was about.
Yes. Well,
if Thomas Aquinas had been put in that same room, he also would have shooed the women out and sat down and finished his book. I don't think he would have been unhappy there.
No, you're probably right.
Don't agree with me too quickly.
No, I won't.
Hell is also the absence of God, and that's what was absent from Rocky's life.
That's true.
You say?
Well, yes. No, I don't think Thomas would be happy there either, but he would just be seeking the Lord there. So,
but he also would not. Let me put it this way. I don't think he'd be tormented by boredom.
No.
But Eddie had lived Eddie. I keep calling him Eddie. Rocky had lived a life such that he was not suited to anything but short-term pleasure seeking. You say. So he's not going to, even given infinite resources and endless wish fulfillment, he's not going to find happiness. Now, Rod Serling seemed to indicate that it was the struggle that made men happy, which I just don't think is the right answer either. He doesn't say that, but it's kind of hinted at in this episode.
Yeah.
I think this episode is partly right, but very misleading if you take it too seriously. Because if you take it too seriously, you'd begin to believe that heaven itself was also a boring place where people just sit on clouds and play harps and no one has any fun. You know.
Well, I would note it's like a number of other things we've come across when discussing things. Ayn Rand and other people, they get the they diagnose the problem, but they miss the solution.
Right.
So then, like they're insightful, but their philosophical presuppositions make them rule out the right answer to the question. So
they're correct on a surface level. They're shallow, but they're right. They're deep. They're deep about their analysis of the problem. They're right about the way evil works. Rod Serling knew what this kind of. Rod Serling describes this character to a T in his opening dialogue, a monologue. And Ayn Rand understood villains better than anyone I've ever known. I used to think she was exaggerating that villains were that way until I heard them talk that way. Until I ran into a lot of them. You see? Now, and I knew, by the way, I did not know what Rod Serling's religious background was, but when you listen to the opening monologue of the first season, in the other seasons, in the second and third season, it's shorter.
There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Now, that's a very interesting description of man's imagination, is it not? Because he contrasts between science and superstition as if one is good and the other is bad. That's not the way a religious person would talk. And he doesn't say it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his hopes. No, he says knowledge.
Yeah.
You see? So I detect the slight odor of secularism, of kind of a... he was born Jewish, and many secular Jews have a crusading spirit to them. And he did. He was opposed to censorship, and he was anti-war, and he was opposed to racism. Several of his episodes are poignant condemnations of racism. But he also doesn't have any episode that shows anything beyond that. It doesn't have anything even as uplifting as a Miyazaki film. And as far as I know, Miyazaki is not Christian. So he's good at exploring the dark areas of the Twilight Zone, but I don't see many episodes where he knows what the light consists of, you see. But he does know the dark area very well, and he knows that the devil, Mr. Pip, shows up as a very genial, very welcoming, very polite person who you just insult him and it just water off his back. He doesn't insist on gratitude. No one has to give any thanksgiving to Mr. Pip or to his Uncle Screwtape or to Mephistopheles or any of the other crew that work down there in the land where you get everything you want and you don't share it with anyone. Oh, we should keep in mind that one of the pleasures that Rocky does not get is companionship. He's got dames, sure, but there's a scene where he asks for his old friends and is told that they can't show up here. So, in heaven you get to meet your loved ones again, but in the other place you don't get to meet your old buddies.
You're alone forever,
even though they're there. Didn't C.S. Lewis say a very similar thing in The Great Divorce? Where hell was this dreary place where you could have any house you wanted, but people just moved further and further from each other in the rain.
What happened was, yes, the houses, it would rain, and that wouldn't... You have a house, but it doesn't keep the rain out. You can imagine whatever you want, so people don't need anything. It's similar in that regard, but all of the people there are... they're sort of reduced to... All of the good is taken out of them. They're just sort of reduced to what they were, or just they're reduced to that final thing they want to be, and it's kind of miserable. But they end up being quarrelsome and they don't get on with each other, as you can imagine. So they all just keep moving further away. And one of the characters in The Great Divorce is trying to bring something back from the outskirts of heaven that they travel to on the bus, so that he can set up an economic system so they'll have to stay together. And he's just mocked by one of the people there. We
found out from Rocky Valentine they have no needs there. You see?
Yeah.
He gets everything he wants. He wins every pool game. Watching it a second time, I wonder what he was going to do with all that money and why he was so happy to have it, because he can get any worldly good he wishes. You say.
Well, this is when
so it raises a deep question. It says not only are worldly goods ultimately not satisfying, they're actually a torture. He's in hell. I'm sorry, he's in the other place. Back in the day, we did not use words like that on the air. That was back when our society had a level of decency we were never going to see again. So,
but I was interested. St. Thomas, when he talks about things in which a man's happiness consists, the first one is, does happiness consist in wealth? Effectively, if you look at them, he's ranking them from dumbest possible option to best possible option.
I noticed our good friend Rocky is on the lowest level because, of course, he's a lowlife. He's supposed to be a lowlife, you see. But I myself, because I'm a writer, I think that's the character we're supposed to identify with. Okay? Yeah. You don't look at that and you go, oh, he's a hero. You look at that and you go, hey, I'm kind of that way. If you're honest, if you're going to be honest with yourself, But they make him a despicable guy otherwise, because all he wants is money, and that's part of the thing that makes him despicable. And as Thomas Aquinas could have told him, happiness does not consist of money.
Well, this is interesting. He said
happiness consists of things you buy with money. You go to the happiness store, you buy a jug of happiness. Is that right? Is that the way it works?
No. Well,
No?
So I don't know I don't know how familiar the listeners are with Thomas's work, but the way it's structured is he asks a question, he gives the best possible objections, he gives like really the strongest objections he could come up with, and then he goes, on the contrary, no, and then he answers that, and then goes back and does each objection one by one. And whether a man's happiness consists in wealth, objection 1, it would seem that man's happiness consists in wealth. For since happiness is man's last end, it must consist in that which has the greatest hold on man's affection. Now this is wealth, for it is written in Ecclesiastes, all things obey money. Therefore, man's happiness consists in wealth.
Because he uses a special terminology, you should explain to the listeners that a man's end here means the thing at which you aim.
True.
It's your goal. He doesn't mean it's your death. He means it's your point in life.
Yes. So it's your final end. It's your summum
It's the
bonum.
purpose.
Summum bonum? Yes, the purpose of your existence.
Right. The summum bonum.
And so what your existence is aimed at, and
right. And he quotes Ecclesiastes of all things, of course, because Solomon is doing the same thing that Aquinas is doing. Solomon asks the question and provides different answers, and then says, "No, vanity is all his vanity." What is Rocky going to use his money on? What is he going to spend money on in hell? He doesn't need to eat. That's one of the things I thought was kind of creepy, by the way. When Rocky sits down to a wonderful meal and he invites Mr. Pip to come to eat with him, Mr. Pip says, "Oh, I don't remember how to eat. It's been so long since I did." And that's the first time he says something when you go, "Wait a minute, what is he? Is he human or what is he?" See, so what's next after money? What's number 2?
Well,
Oh, no, pardon me. I don't want to rush it. Tell me more about.
Let me
tell
finish
more about
slowly.
money.
Now, it's actually wealth, and there's natural wealth and artificial wealth. So it's important to make that distinction. And natural wealth is, I live in a house and I have enough to eat and I drive a nice car and
Resources.
Effectively, yes, and that has natural limits. Like you can only eat so much, you can only use one house at a time, etc., etc.
Right.
Like there's just that can be satiated. Artificial wealth, money can't actually be satiated that way.
Right.
The appetite for that just goes on forever.
Right.
But he says, I actually think his on the contrary for this. There's a couple of other objections, but the on the contrary is, man's good consists in retaining happiness rather than spreading it. But as Boethius says, wealth shines in giving rather than hoarding, for the miser is hateful, whereas the generous man is applauded. Therefore, man's happiness cannot consist in wealth.
Excellent. I noticed that Rocky Valentine never tips anyone.
No.
Oh, no, wait, that's not true. He does give a hat full of coins to some of his babes, some of his dames.
but probably at the point where he's realizing that doesn't mean anything. He's not. I mean, he doesn't do that initially.
Even in Act 2, when he's still delighted with all his good fortune.
Oh, that's
I
true.
think he's generously giving things away because that's what a big man is supposed to do. While he's there smoking a cigar,
Yeah.
which he can smoke in hell. He's not going to die of cancer now. It's a win-win.
Can enjoy all
His
the
cigars, his other bodily pleasures like wine and the cigars on the list of Aquinas, or I believe Aquinas lived before cigars were invented. Because,
We'll get to that.
That was not until America was discovered. So
Wow.
never mind. No one in the Middle Ages smoked a cigar. I just want the viewers to know that.
Or cigarettes. Yes.
Right.
But so he goes on from there. It's interesting how many of these are illustrated in the episode. Whether a man's happiness consists in honors, it would seem that man's happiness consists in honors. For happiness or bliss is the reward of virtue, as the philosopher says. The philosopher being Aristotle.
Right.
But honor, more than anything else, seems to be that which virtue is rewarded, as the philosopher says. Therefore, happiness consists especially in honor.
Now, this is only touched on very lightly in the episode because there's no one around to give him a title, make him a duke or anything. But please notice that everyone calls him Mr. Valentine.
Yeah.
Of all the props, and Mr. Pip also calls him by his last name and treats him like he's a big man and puts a shiny name on the door of his apartment. So he is given honors also, and they don't satisfy him.
And of course, on the contrary, happiness is in the happy, but honor is not in the honored, but rather in those who honor, and who offers deference to the person honored. There we go. As the philosopher says, therefore happiness does not consist in honor. He says, I answer that it is impossible for happiness to consist in honor, for honor is given to a man on account of some excellence in him, and consequently, it is a sign and attestation of the excellence that is in the person honored.
Now that is brilliant. This is why St. Thomas
That's
Aquinas
Thomas.
this is why Aquinas is a genius. Because many people these days, I would even say most people, think that by getting the signs of honor, we call it virtue signaling.
We do.
They think that by getting money, they will get the virtue that allows you to be industrious and creative, which is what money usually rewards in a free society. They think that by being called sir and ma'am, they will get the honors that is due someone who has behaved in a fashion to make him noble and knightly. They think that if you call someone married, or you call him a man when he wants to be married when he's not married, or he wants to be a man when he's a woman, then they think that just by giving the name, giving the title, they'll get the honor. Whereas all that happens is the person thinks he's being cheated because it doesn't make him happy, and in some cases the guy will end up committing suicide because the thing he was told he wanted, the shallow outward symbol of the inner good, is not enough. He wants the inner good, but is not willing to admit that.
No, I agree. Thomas is a genius. The only problem with Thomas is he's extremely concise, which is not a bad thing. No, it's
may
not
the
a bad
Lord
thing.
curse me with that problem. No, I understand. He's hard reading. You have to read one sentence at a time, and then
and often more than once.
Word.
And
I agree.
Yes.
It's hard going. It's hard going. You have to find like Peter Kreeft's version if you don't want to.
It's
like climbing a sheer mountain rather than going up a ladder, though. It's
Yeah.
I agree. That is actually a problem.
But
It is
I mean,
concise.
it's
concise and brilliant. There's a problem.
No, it's brilliant and concise, but you usually have to read it more than once. You'll get stuff out of reading it each time, which is nice. So
that's the sign of a great book, by the way. And I would also say it's a sign of a great TV show if you can watch it more than once and get more out of it each time. If you go back and watch that Twilight Zone episode, you'll see Mr. Pip is really sinister right from the get-go. Even though the first time you saw it, he looked like he was an angel. He looked like he was the guy from Here Comes Mr. Jordan, which is also a movie made about that same time.
But there were little signs,
which had a similar proposition. So.
Oh, we should note before we go too far afield, when St. Thomas says happiness, he means, it's translated as happiness, but happiness is not the best word for it. Happiness shares the same. Look at me being all etymological. Yes, etymological, not entomological.
I was about to say. Entomology always bugs me. So
Indeed.
whereas I can tell you where the word etymology comes from. No, I'm kidding. I can't actually tell you.
But it comes from the same. It comes from the English word "hap," which we also get happenstance from. And
Right.
happiness is so in English. Happiness is transitory and passing, and
Happiness is something.
This
that
is
just
not
so
what he's
happens
talking.
It just so
Yeah.
happens to take place by happenstance.
there you go.
You know, it's not a thing.
And that's not.
I suggest
quite
a
what
better
we're aiming at.
translation for what he's talking about is a philosophical concept. He's talking about the end at which a thing is aimed. He's talking about the fulfillment or the perfection of the thing. I think fulfillment might be a good term to use, because when you say what's going to make a man happy, Rocky Valentine was happy for the
Briefly.
first month he was in the other place because he had wine, woman, and song. But that's not the end toward which his life
It doesn't
is
last.
directed,
yes.
so it doesn't satisfy him. It drives him crazy. In fact, you see. So
Yes.
fulfillment. He's not fulfilled, even if he's happy.
Yes. He's not
Transitorily
satisfied.
happy
Yes.
for the moment.
He needs to be satisfied, not merely happy. Blessed
Right.
is another way you might translate it.
Blessed is good. Also, the reason why I say perfect is because when something is perfected, that doesn't mean it never makes an error. That means that it's fulfilled its designed function. A hammer is perfect when it hammers, because hammers are designed for hammering.
Mm-hmm.
You see, a human is perfect when he loves, knows, and serves the Lord, because that's the end toward which we are made.
Mm-hmm.
People who don't know why they're made don't know who they are. See, and in the case of Rocky, don't know what they want.
Ultimately, yes.
He could wish for anything. He didn't wish for wisdom, happiness, or knowledge.
This
He
is
didn't wish
true.
to see the face of the Lord.
No.
You know?
Which is presumably what St. Thomas would do immediately upon being there.
Well, I got to say that the name is a dead giveaway because it's a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to stay there.
Yes.
Is of course what the joke is. If hell is a place, if hell is actually an earthly paradise where you get all of your base desires satisfied, you don't want to stay there.
No. It'll be fun for a month.
It'll be fun for a month and then it'll be torture. Right.
So Thomas next goes to whether man's happiness consists in fame or glory. It would seem that man's happiness consists in glory, for happiness seems to consist in that which is paid to the saints for the trials they have undergone in the world. But this is glory, for the apostle says, the apostle being Paul, the sufferings of this time are not worthy to be compared with the glory to come, that shall be revealed to us. Therefore, happiness consists in glory. On the contrary, happiness is man's true good.
It's a parallel argument to saying it's honors. Honors is when the earthly people give you a high status or a high rank, and glory is when spiritual people do, right?
So
I suspect we're going to see the same thing. It's going to be the dog being wagged by the tail.
Yeah, it's a
rather
little
than the dog
better.
wagging the tail.
It's a
Let's
little
see.
higher than the
Let's
last
go on.
one.
No, I'm fascinated. This is now like a detective story for me. I want to know what the trick answer is going to be. What the surprise ending is going to be.
On the contrary, happiness is man's true good, but it happens that fame or glory is false. For as Boethius says, man owes their renown to the lying reports spread among the people. Can anything be more shameful? For those who receive false fame must needs blush at their own praise. Therefore, man's happiness does not consist in fame or glory. If it's not genuine, it doesn't count. So, and if it can be false.
Let me point out to those who don't know, Boethius was a writer who, when he was on death row, penned a book called The Consolations of Philosophy, talking about how no matter how painful life was, even if you were a prisoner on death row, philosophy, by which he meant theology, could lead you to a serene and stoical way of facing your end. You could still be happy in the technical sense. You're not. I mean, no one's going to be pleased at being on death row.
You're
but
going to be joyous.
You could still be perfected. You could still be fulfilled, doing what you must do as best you can do it. And so he engages in a dialogue with the personification of philosophy, and he himself also goes through a lot of these questions the same way Solomon does, and the same way much more rigorously Aquinas here is doing. So man's joy does not consist of fame. I should also say that in the poem Orlando Furioso, written by Ariosto, we find out that if you hop on the back of a hippogriff and fly to the moon, that's where fame is kept, in a lake where people's names are thrown, and before they're drowned by time, storks or owls or some other unclean bird, I forget which, plucks some names out, and those are the poets who make people famous. And it's always people who don't deserve it. And the moon, of course, is the sphere where lunatics come from.
Yeah.
So to pursue, the poet was trying to say that to pursue fame is a lunacy. And I say this as a guy who, if I was more famous as a writer, I wouldn't mind. But it's not what life consists of.
It won't satisfy you.
No.
Well, this brings us to Article 4. And I think this is, it's whether man's happiness consists in power. And I think this is interesting because at the moment, we seem to be at a bit of an inflection point in history with Klaus Schwab and his buddies seeking power over everybody. Our politicians are seeking to control us. And politicians are usually wealthy, are usually well regarded, and usually have some fame to their name, at least by the people they care about. So they've worked down to power, and this seems to be where they're up to, trying everything before admitting they need God. So whether a man's happiness consists in power, it would seem that happiness consists in power. For all things desire to become like to God, as to their last end and first beginning, but men who are in power seem, on account of the similarity of power, to be most like to God.
Let me interrupt to say that back in the day, the Pharaoh was worshipped as a god.
That's true.
That the Chinese emperor was the son of heaven. He had godlike properties. That the Japanese emperor to this day is the lineal blood descendant of the sun goddess. Okay? And the same thing for the priest kings of the Middle East, and so on and so forth. And Caesar was given divine honors, and many of the emperors were paid honors as an immortal, as a god. Okay, so to be worshipped as a god is something that a lot of these powerful people wanted, literally back in the old days. Nowadays, I think Charles Schwab and George Soros and the other masterminds who think they can control the complexity of the world by controlling the internet and controlling the money supply. I don't think they require a physical idol to be set up to them, but I could be wrong about that.
I'd be willing to bet
I'm waiting for the abomination of desolation
to
be moved into the temple to be worshipped, because I think that's going to happen again.
I fear so.
Once the temple's rebuilt.
But on the contrary, happiness is the perfect good, but power is most imperfect. For as Boethius says, the power of man cannot relieve the gnawings of care, nor can it avoid the thorny path of anxiety. And further on, think you a man is powerful who is surrounded by attendants, whom he inspires with fear, indeed, but whom he fears still more. Which is, it's touching on the idea of, I've heard this said about slave owners. The slaves are dependent on the slave master, but the slave master is as equally dependent on them.
And he goes to bed at night worrying he's going to be murdered in his sleep.
Yes.
And he also stops being able to do any labor himself. His situation in life makes him lazy, and he's forced to become less and less human. He's got to start treating all his slaves like animals. And the same thing happens to a dictator. A dictator, even if he has good intentions in the beginning, and they always claim to have good intentions in the beginning, will end up ordering millions to their deaths in death camps. Or if they're Mao, billions. Hundreds of millions, I should say, rather, not billions.
Tens of billions, yes.
But the problem with power is that they don't actually have it. I should say, Plato had Socrates tell the myth of where a Persian named died and saw the afterlife, and he saw that men choose their next life when they're going through the cycle of reincarnation. And if they decided to be a king, they often didn't stop to examine how that guy would come to an end, or what would happen to his family. I mean, every family occasionally has arguments between like father and son, but if you're a king, those arguments end with a murder or a civil war. Okay.
Yep.
And Socrates also talked about the misery of tyrants. He talked about the myth of Gyges. Gyges had a magic ring that could turn him invisible. He used it to kill the king and to marry the king's wife and become a tyrant. And yet Socrates argued that guy could not be happy because the happiness didn't. And he gave the same argument that Aquinas here gives, that the happiness doesn't consist of merely having power to do things.
Well, he says, I answer, it is impossible for happiness to consist in power, and this is for two reasons. First, because power has the nature of principle, whereas happiness has the nature of last end. Fair enough. Second, because power has relation to good and evil, whereas happiness is man's proper end and perfect good. Wherefore, some happiness might consist in the good use of power, which is by virtue rather than by power itself. So the fact that it can be misused means it can't be our final end.
Oh, that's a very interesting argument. I've never heard that one before.
Yeah, no, that's what I thought. I thought, yeah,
The fact that it can be misused means it can't be the final end, because only obviously the right use is the proper use, and so whatever makes the right use right is the end. It's what the good consists of.
Exactly.
That's very interesting.
Yes.
That means that no utility can be the final end. Efficiency, for example, cannot be the final end. Many people argue in favor of a free market as opposed to a communism in the name of efficiency, but that's not the real argument. The real argument is that a free market is moral and communism is immoral. You know, as much as I disagree with her on other grounds, Ayn Rand made that argument. She understood the evil well enough, but she wasn't smart enough to make the same argument Aquinas just made, which is to say the free market can't be the final end, can't be the final good of man, because it can also be abused. The free market can also buy and sell slaves or pornography or contraceptives or so on and so forth.
The free market is excellent at satisfying demands, whatever they are. That's
just
the problem.
Just like Rocky
why it's good.
in the other place, he had the perfect way to have all his demands satisfied. You know, but they weren't rightly ordered, were they?
No. We're getting a bit higher now. Article 5, whether man's happiness consists in any bodily good. It would seem that man's happiness consists in bodily goods, for it is written, there is no riches above the riches of the health of the body. So this is to be in good health. But happiness consists in that which is best, therefore it consists in the health of the body.
Clever. I noticed the cleverness of his organization, because he starts with money, and he says, well, money can't buy fame, it can't buy honor, you know.
Yep.
And then honor can't buy glory, and then having glory is not going to help you have power. Power is not going to help you when you have a headache. Even the pharaoh could not take an aspirin. Okay,
that's correct.
The free market can give you an aspirin, but if your highest good is being healthy and physically healthy, not in pain, that's something that you know even the pharaoh can't give. But tell us what Aquinas says as to why that's not.
On the contrary, man surpasses. On the contrary, man surpasses all other animals in regard to happiness, but in bodily goods he is surpassed by many animals, for instance, by the elephant in longevity, by the lion in strength, by the stag in fleetness. Therefore man's happiness does not consist in the goods of the body. I answer that it's impossible for man's happiness to consist in the goods of the body, and this is for two reasons. First, because if a thing be ordained to another as its end, its last end cannot consist in the preservation of its being. So,
in other words, the good can't just be life because A, you can't stay alive forever, and B, you have to live for something. It's similar to the argument we just heard. Your life can be good or evil. It can be directed toward a good, evil, or a bad. It can be directed toward a good end or a bad end. You see, so just staying alive. The Methuselah philosophy that the good consists of just staying alive can't satisfy you. In fact, as we just found out from the Twilight Zone, that's not the only story where a guy discovers immortality and then discovers that it's nightmarish to him because he can't stay alive. I mean, he will have no friends. The Struldbrugs described in Gulliver's Travel, for example, are immortal, but they live lives of hellish misery. You see, so
yes,
it's a common theme in science fiction, where humans would not be satisfied even if we were immortal, even if we had endless life, because life is not what gives us happiness. It's not our end. It's not the thing to which we're directed.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
There's another Twilight Zone. I forget the name of it, where the character is a hypochondriac and is offered immortality and imperviousness to harm, and initially it's working out great for him. He's throwing himself under trains and doing all sorts of things, and then collecting insurance settlements. and getting wealthy that way. Because he's survived, but they'll pay him off because he could have been killed. Not that he can be killed. And
Right.
he's very happy with this turn of events because he was this just miserable hypochondriac. But eventually kills his wife. He pushes her down the light shaft of their apartment block and he's like, oh, that must be wonderful. Because I'll do that and nothing will happen. And he grows bored with it. But then he gets imprisoned. And he's there going, yeah, give me the death penalty, it'll be fine, or give me prison, whatever, I don't care, because he's going to live forever. And then he gets imprisoned for murder for the term of his natural life. And he's like, oh crap, and then he dies. Then he has the devil basically that he made the deal with come back and take the deal away from him, and he dies, and he gets his soul. But yes, it's a similar sort of idea.
There's a similar story, and I don't know who wrote it. It comes from the old days. It comes from the Middle Ages, or no, maybe later. Excuse me. It might be English. Might be a Victorian, of a guy who makes a deal with the devil to become immortal, but he's not told that what's going to happen is after he gets hanged for murder, they bury him, and he recovers underground, and he's still there.
Oh,
Well,
that's one of the things about. I've seen that observation about living forever would be terrible. Eventually, you will find yourself trapped somewhere and unable to get out.
Yep. Yep.
But it brings us to Article 6. Whether man's happiness consists in pleasure. It would seem that man's happiness consists in pleasure, for since happiness is the last end, it is not desired for something else, but other things for it. But this answers to pleasure more than to anything else, for it's absurd to ask anyone what is his motive in wishing to be pleasured, wishing to be pleased. Whoops. Therefore, happiness consists principally
in the case
in pleasure and delight.
In the case of Rocky Valentine, it's both, so you can say it that way.
And of course, on the contrary, Boethius says, anyone that chooses to look back on his past excesses will perceive that pleasure had a sad ending. And if they can render a man happy, there is no reason why we should not say that the very beasts are happy too. Because bodily delights are more generally known, the name of pleasure has been appropriated to them, although other delights excel in them, and yet happiness does not consist in them. Because in everything that which pertains to its essence is distinct from its proper accident. These get a bit more esoteric as you go along, but
he's saying it's not the thing itself. When he talks about essence and accident, he's saying pleasure is the thing that drives you toward a good, such as, for example, the romantic pleasures drive you to reproduction, drive you to family unity. And the family is actually an image or a microcosm of the relation of the church to the Lord, you see. Now, beasts also mate, and they also, I assume, take pleasure in mating. But if life consisted just of that, then, how can I say this? I once saw a show on MTV, which was maybe the shallowest thing I ever saw, where all the men and women, who were all beautiful and handsome, were all gorgeous, simply acted like satyrs and nymphs. They had no desire for anything other than momentary sexual liaisons with each other, as if their life had nothing else to it and would never have anything else to it.
Was
it
Jersey
they lived
Shore?
in I'll call it the perfect contraceptive society. But if you actually placed a human being among the nymphs and satyrs, that human being would be Rocky Valentine. It would be hell for him.
Eventually.
He could have a month of wild flings among the nymphs who don't love him, who don't care for him, who don't care whether he's alive or dead. I noticed that none of the women in the Twilight Zone have names.
They don't need them.
Rocky doesn't care about the name. He doesn't care about the person. See? So, people are confusing the Christmas wrapping with the present, of course. Now, it's nice to have a pretty Christmas wrapper. As Marilyn Monroe says in How to Marry a Millionaire, or one of those shallow movies, a girl being pretty is nice, but it's not what the marriage is about. And a guy being rich is also nice, but it's not what the marriage is about. But and then she winks at the camera and says, "But it helps." Okay, it's like having a nice wrapping. It's like having a nice Christmas present. But if you went down on Christmas and you were a little kid and you had all these beautiful presents and they were all wrapped and they were all empty, all that would happen was the camera would pan over to Rod Serling and be staring at you going, the present you wish for is not, be careful what you wish for in the Twilight Zone.
Yes.
So no, happiness does not consist of pleasure, because if
No.
it did, for one thing, we would not be having this conversation. Aquinas would not have written that book. If happiness consisted of pleasure, nothing is more easy to understand as to how to get. Okay? You go to the casino, you go to the whorehouse, you go to a place where they have pleasure jugs, and you just drink a jug of pleasure, and then you'd be fine. Okay?
Yes, exactly.
Well, no.
Most people find that horrific.
If you lived on a planet where they did that, the first time Captain Kirk would visit, he would blow up the computer that runs your society, and he would set you back on the path of human life.
Well, it's sort of never touched on in Star Trek, but it's touched on in Voyager. Voyager? No, it's touched on in the original series. No, The Next Generation with Lieutenant Barclay, who has holodeck addiction.
Yeah.
And he's in this perfect paradise fantasy that he's made on a holodeck. And everyone is horrified at this because...
Except for me, who I was envious, because he actually had the political officer, I forget her name, was the counselor. They didn't call her political officer. Deanna Troi. He had Deanna Troi in there as the goddess of love. And what's funny is the counselor was trying to be sympathetic to him because it was a psychological problem, and she's the ship's psychologist. Until she saw that, and then she goes, "Throw him in the brig."
Yes.
Another good show, by the way, Star Trek.
No,
I don't think it's as good as Twilight Zone. I think Twilight Zone really got to some depths and some heights. But I'm interrupting. I apologize. You were saying
that's okay.
About the
but yeah,
Barclay had Paradise.
But it's the same sort of thing, mind you. In reality, if we had holodecks, you'd need to hose those things out.
Yeah,
it'd be gross.
Well, we have the internet now, which in one of my science fiction books, I had the future historians looking back on this age and just call it the porn net, because they weren't sure. Future archaeologists couldn't tell that we did anything else with it. Even though we've got all the knowledge of mankind at a fingertip and you can carry it in your pocket.
Yep.
Okay. In the old days, you had to walk uphill both ways in the snow to get to a library that might have a handwritten copy of Thomas Aquinas. Now, anyone in the sound of my voice can just yank it out of his pocket and read what you're reading.
Yep.
And it's the wisdom of mankind. Do people want it? No. They want to go. They want what Rocky Valentine had. That's what most people want. Most people want to go, not to heaven, but to the other place.
You think they should...
Isn't that wrong? Isn't that odd?
Maybe we should make this mandatory viewing. When I am the TED.
Well, if we had power, we could make it mandatory, but power does not bring happiness necessarily.
Curse this knowledge.
Hey, that's what the curse did come because of knowledge of good and evil. I'll just point out,
That's true. Well, this brings us to Article 7, where we're getting a bit beyond where Rocky got to. Whether some good of the soul constitutes man's happiness. It would seem that some good of the soul constitutes man's happiness, for happiness is man's good. Now, this is threefold: external goods, goods of the body, and goods of the soul. But happiness does not consist in external goods, nor in goods of the body, as shown above. Therefore, it consists in goods of the soul.
Now, by goods of the soul, does he mean things like knowledge and serenity? Does he mean virtue? What does he mean?
That's the sort of thing he's talking about. And he says, on the contrary,
virtue is going to run into the same problem we had before, because if I'm like a courageous man, I can use my courage for good or evil. Or if I'm a temperate man, I'm not sure I can be temperate for evil, but I guess I could be. I could proceed toward creating the new world order in a very slow and patient way, like Schwab and others are doing. So I guess that could also be misused. I'm sorry, please continue.
But he says,
want to hear what's going to happen.
On the contrary, as Augustine says, that which constitutes the life of happiness is to be loved for its own sake. But man is not to be loved for his own sake, but whatever is in a man to be loved for God's sake. Therefore, happiness consists in no good of the soul. So there's nothing in man. You are to love your fellow man because he is made in the image of God, not for anything instrumental in the man itself.
Now, here's why that's interesting. You say you said Rock. Excuse me. The reason I keep confusing the name is because there's a character named Eddie Valentine in the movie The Rocketeer, which is a favorite movie of mine, and he's also
I love
a
that film.
gangster.
It's a good film. Yep.
So it's a good film. Rocky also doesn't approach that, and here's why. Not because he led the life of a crook, but even if he had been the guy from the other Twilight Zone episode who wanted to just read books after the Holocaust. If you remember, he breaks his glasses and can't read. Let's suppose he goes. Let's suppose he goes to the other place and he gets everything he wants, so he can read any book he wants. He's going to be in hell too. He's going to be tortured after about a month, because even after he's read as many books as he likes, his good is not going to be able to consist just of whatever virtues he has in himself. You see, a man in perfect solitude is not tolerable. The only reason why hermits and monks can do it is because they're alone with God.
Yep.
They're not just alone with themselves. That's a punishment. That's solitary confinement.
Even
You
then,
see? That's
then.
Yes?
Sorry, I would note, early on in the Christian church, being a hermit alone with God was fashionable for a while, but that quickly evolved into the monastery because most people can't live alone like that. They go insane.
Well, not just that, but they all learned how to be alone together. And that's a great way to be alone. Because, otherwise... And it was more, being alone just in a cave was more an Eastern thing than a Western thing. So, yep. But understandable. Because man is not good for man to be alone. Not only does Aristotle say man is a political animal, but God says it's not good for him to be alone. So...
That being said, I've met people and they're awful. So
yes. So the good of people doesn't consist in man. The good of man is not in man. That's why I can never believe Gnosticism. That's why I can never believe the idea that you're God or that you're part of God or that you're godly. Because if you're going to kneel at an altar and sacrifice to a God who is greater than you, you're going to propitiate the wrath of an all-powerful God, and it's just your looking glass and it's just your mirror, and you go, wow. Okay, I'm sorry. What blessing can I grant myself that I can't do?
Yeah.
If I could make my life happy by merely granting it to myself by myself, I would be either a modern person or I'd be insane, or maybe both.
Both.
Because modern people have that insanity. They seem to think that they can grant themselves benevolence, they can grant themselves a happy life merely by an act of will. But if that were the case, then the other place we just saw in the Twilight Zone episode would be a paradise. Because then Valentine could just say, I grant me my own blessing. I've just made up my mind to be perfectly happy here in a place of perfect comfort.
Yep.
It's not going to happen.
This brings us to the last article, the big one. Whether any created good constitutes man's happiness. So that's literally everything but God and maybe numbers.
Well, I think God made this too.
Well,
but every created good includes both the seen and the unseen order.
Yep.
So I'll point out to those
everything.
people who do not believe in resurrection, but do believe in reincarnation, merely believe there's a spiritual order where they will be turned into humans over and over again. Some of them think they could become higher beings, like become godlike. But all those are still within creation. All those are still something...
That is covered by this.
Even if you believe what the Easterners believe, or what Socrates hinted at, that you could become through many reincarnations, you can become a spiritual being and lose all bodily desires. Socrates didn't want to have a body. He's not a Christian. Christians are going to be reincarnated in the flesh. Just by the way, okay. This argument, Aquinas here is saying, not so. Nothing in the created order is going to satisfy you.
Well, this is it.
Visible or invisible, this world or the spirit world. Because the spirit world was created too.
Well, here we go. It would seem that some created good constitutes man's happiness, for Dionysius says that divine wisdom unites the ends of the first thing to the beginning of the second things, from which we may gather that the summit of a lower nature touches the base of the higher nature, but man's highest good is happiness. Since then the angel is above the man in the order of nature, it seems that man's happiness consists in man somehow reaching the angel. What you were saying. There you go.
Exactly what I was saying. Yeah.
On the contrary,
by the way, which is very similar to things that the pagan philosophers talked about. And that's what the Gnostics believe. They believe that man, by overcoming the illusion and the trap of the created order, will return to the pleorma, will return to the perfect happiness where all their desires are satisfied. which I from now on will call the other place, where the Gnostics are headed.
On the contrary, Augustine says, as the soul is the life of the body, so God is man's life. So God is man's life of happiness, of whom it is written, happy is the people whose God is the Lord. I answer that it's impossible for any created good to constitute man's happiness, for happiness is the perfect good, which lulls the appetite altogether, else it would not be the last end. If something yet remained to be desired, now the object of the will, i.e. of man's appetite, is the universal good, just as the object of the intellect is the universal true, hence it is evident that naught can lull man's will save the universal good. This is to be found not in any creature but in God alone, because every creature has goodness by participation, whereas God alone can satisfy the will of man, according to the words of Psalm 102, verse 5, who satisfieth thy desire with good things? Therefore, God alone constitutes man's happiness.
Excellent. And that, by the way, is where
it's wordy, but
that's where I think where the Twilight Zone episode falls short. I think it's true, but it doesn't go far enough. Like a lot of things in life, it's... I should say, there are many pagan stories that I think have a hint of Christian truth to them.
Of course.
That foreshadow Christ and that build toward Christ, and that also develop the appetite toward Christ. The thing that the pagans yearn for and can't satisfy is in Christ, in my opinion.
I agree.
Now, this show is also true about the nature of human happiness. It's not going to be satisfied with worldly pleasure. Now, we don't see a similar episode where a school teacher goes to the other place, and I'll point out that Sebastian Cabot actually says that there are school teachers who also end up here. Eddie Valiant says, "I thought this place was only for school teachers," when he thinks it's heaven. And Mr. Pip says, "Oh, but there's many school teachers also end up here." Well, a school teacher, they're surrounded, let's say, by books, or doing trying to find some other pleasure in some other created thing, like knowledge, for example, is also going to end up being tortured after a month. You see, and the reason why is because the satisfaction of what drives us to a thing is the thing that cures the satisfaction. Let me back up and use an example.
Sure.
When someone is ill, the only thing they think about is getting better. When they're in pain, the only thing they think about is ceasing to be in pain.
Yep.
In some of the science fiction stories I mentioned earlier, which try to show the futility of immortality, one thing they often do is they say, well, if you were immortal and then you were no longer in pain, you would not have any goal. Because the person saying that, the only goal they can imagine is the cessation of unease, the sensation of pain, you see? As if we ate only to stop being hungry, but didn't get nutrition from it. No, the reason why you once you're out of pain, once you're out of loneliness, once you're out of hunger, then you do things, then you live your life, then you do your work, then you write a poem, then you do something to add to creation. Because we are made in the image and likeness of God, we have the creation impulse in us. Some more than others. I mean, I'm a writer, so I have it more than a lot of people. But my impulse is no different from that of a carpenter who wants to make something look good, or a shoemaker who wants to make a shoe fit for a human to wear. But even that desire is not the final end, is not the final good which we desire. Because neither the writer nor the carpenter nor the shoemaker just wants to make anything. They want to make something good, something useful. And this points toward the ultimate good. Everything points toward the ultimate good. You can be a ditch digger and glorify God if you do the ditch digging in his name and in his honor.
Yeah.
And you dig a good ditch rather than doing it in a lazy, shiftless, and dishonest way. You see? So that's the one thing where I think the Twilight Zone episode, while it's true, is not the whole truth. It doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't tell the rest of the story.
And I should note, Thomas's article here is quite a bit longer, and I would recommend people read the whole thing. We're just sort of grabbing some snippets from it to illustrate the point. But yes, so we come back to how do you find happiness in life? What will ultimately satisfy you? And we're back to repent on your knees and turn back to God. We always get there. I don't think we're ever not going to get there.
Because you and I are discussing the entire universe, and so obviously we're always going to come back to the where it comes from and where it's
This is
going
true.
and what it's for.
This
You
is
see,
true.
the sages of all ages, the wisest men of the East and the smartest philosophers of the West, all wanted to know the end of man. They wanted to know what the meaning of life was. And then our Lord came and told it to a bunch of Jewish fishermen. So, so if you want to find wisdom, you have to look for it where you least expect it.
Expect it. Yes.
Okay.
Well, to be expected. Probably should be to be expected.
Well,
Anyway.
who would expect that? What are you talking about? That's not. Who expects that?
If you look at, well, that's true. But
Only if you understand how that the Christian God has a sense of humor.
Well,
how
that's
he
true,
likes
yes.
to elevate the low and humble the high. I don't see that in any pagan stories. I don't see that. I don't see that among Zeus and I mean, excuse me. I do see Zeus wants to punish hubris, wants to punish
Mm-hmm.
overweening pride, but elevating the poor, hiding
No.
wisdom in an old shoe, you know.
True.
So
no, that's certainly true. It is unexpected. But, you know, that's God for you.
I think there we should end it because I think there's no more to be said.
I don't
as
think
we-
there is much more to be said.
As we travel between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge, halfway
Yes.
between science and superstition. You see?
Yes.
Because the Twilight Zone is not just the land of the imagination. All of human life is the Twilight Zone. And the pit he's talking about is the other place. And the summit is not science and knowledge. I'm sorry. Science is not the ultimate good of man. We just established that.
Yep.
So, there we go.
So on that note, thank you everybody for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And we'll be back next week. Thanks for joining me, John.
Thank you, sir.